Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Singapore International Cyber Week 2022. I'm Charmaine E, and I'm delighted to be your host this afternoon. Detection and response capabilities for cybersecurity incident in the operational technology environment today may be challenging, with legacy equipment and vendor restrictions limiting the extent of cybersecurity capabilities that can be deployed to ensure cyber threat visibility. With the constantly evolving cyber threat landscape, threat detection and response for the OT capabilities also need to keep up and evolve to manage tomorrow's cyber threats. This session today hopes to share insights involving people, process, and technology that should be considered to manage tomorrow's threats. To begin this afternoon's event, allow me to introduce our opening remarks speaker, the Director of Critical Information Infrastructure Division, Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, Mr. Lim Tian Chin. Mr. Lim, please.
Esteemed panelists, distinguished guests, a very good afternoon. Welcome to the Operational Technology Conversation Track SICW 2022. Pleased to have all of you with us joining today, including those who are connecting virtually. As the world gradually returns to a state of reminiscent of pre-COVID days, some things are unlikely to go back to the way they are. More companies are connecting their OT systems to the corporate IT systems to reap the benefits and efficiencies of digital connectivity. COVID-19 has accelerated this trend. Unfortunately, with greater connectivity and efficiency, also come greater risks and increased attack surfaces. Cyber threats to OT systems are also evolving. They are becoming more sophisticated and are increasingly spilling over into the physical world with real-world consequences, as evidenced by incidents like Colonial Pipeline, JB Foods, and the Osma Water Plant attack in Florida. These attacks on OT systems are not new, but they have grown, both in number and impact. As the saying goes, time and tide wait for no man. I would also argue that the same can be said about man-made events such as cyber attacks. Threat actors do not care about the challenges of our time. They aren't pulling their punches just because we are struggling with the difficulties of life. It was in recognition of this growing cyber-physical risk that CSA is capitalizing on every single opportunity to engage stakeholders in both the local and regional OT ecosystems. This OT conversation track is the finale of CSA's three-part engagement series in 2022. The OT Cyber Expert Panel, OTCEP, in July, focuses on promulgating sound practices in governance, engineering, and operation aspects of the OT owners. The OT ISAC Summit in September covers a wide breadth of comprehensive topics ranging from cyber exercises to governance to technical capabilities and on the state of OT threat landscape. Today, we move further upstream into the OT ecosystem. This forum aims to provide a platform for knowledge sharing and mutual learning between OT solution providers, and we hope such experiences will continue to catalyze deep and impactful conversation on technical capabilities between industry, policymakers, and researchers. To this end, CSA believes in building generative relationships around regulations, moving away from scorekeeping to sense-making and co-creation, where regulators and the various stakeholders in the ecosystem can work together to build a culture of honesty, trust, open disclosure, and shared discovery. With that, welcome again to the conversation. I wish you all invigorating and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lim. It's with great pleasure to introduce our keynote address speaker, the Global Head of Solutions Engineering at Nozomi Network, Mr. Jeffrey Blake. Mr. Blake, please.
Welcome again, and thanks, Hermaine, for that introduction. I'm going to touch on a few things today that are really food for thought, designed to get us talking, and we have a panel session later, some things for you to consider. If you've been to the show so far, or if you've heard any of the other sessions, there's a lot of talk about new things, emerging threats, and my talk is going to center on really refocusing all of us around some fundamental pieces that we can address right away. I live in the US, and the NBA basketball season just started, and if you're a fan of basketball or any professional sports, you know that when they interview the coaches at the end of the season, the winning coaches are always saying the same thing. Our dedication to the fundamentals of the sport are the things that bring the wins. Everyone loves to see the exotic three-point half-court shots and the buzzer beaters, but it's the teams that are very consistent with their passing, with their gameplay, with their dribbling, all of the less exciting pieces of the game. Those are the winners. And so that's the focus I'd like to sort of build an analogy around. So the first thing, and by the way, I structured this like a top 10 list. So much like some of the clickbait you might be enticed into reading, I kind of framed it out this way. The first thing we can do, let's stop saying that our OT systems are no longer a threat. OT folks, OT security people are very different than IT folks who tend to be extraordinarily over-paranoid. With OT, there's so much more of a delivery of services that security doesn't always get the same level of attention that it should. And so once compliance is reached, once an audit is passed, or once a product is put in place to secure the OT network, many times it's not thought about again. So my guidance to you is stop saying you're compliant. Stop saying you're not a threat, or not going to get threatened, and stop saying you're not going to become a target because your network is air-gapped or something of that sort. Keep in mind, stay paranoid, stay focused. The second thing you can do is recognize that industrial control systems are different from OT. Mr. Lin talked a bit about the convergence of IT and OT. There's a lot of shared services that are beginning to emerge and become part of the conversation. It's a very dangerous ground if those two networks are not strategically integrated and tactically managed. So what I want to make sure we understand is the OT networks look a lot more like an IT network than a SCADA or an ICS network might be. And so the threats are very different as well. OT networks tend to have attacks that are a little less sophisticated. There's a lot of malicious insider threats. There's script kiddies, and the 2019 Ellsworth, Kansas plant, and I think Mr. Lin also mentioned the Old Market, Florida water treatment plant. Those attacks were from people that worked at those facilities. They were disgruntled employees that were terminated for one reason or another, and their introductions back into the network were from oversights, default passwords that hadn't changed, or the lack of a termination process and accounts that were left open even after the employees were terminated. Those are things that are easy to fix but are often overlooked. On the other hand, industrial control networks and systems have very sophisticated attacks. The processing power in those networks is very specific, and the attacks are equally sophisticated. So you think about Stuxnet, Duqu, Flame, all of the legacy attacks that were part of those networks, very, very sophisticated, very, very targeted, and very, very detailed. So make sure your strategies are aligned in the right place, especially as you converge from IT to OT. One of the best things to consider is segmentation. And if you're managing an OT network, and I'll encourage you to, if you don't already, use the Purdue network of segmentation. That is a wonderful way to really look at your organizational, your topology, your approach to the network. Many products from the vendors that are here today align to that, and it's very different from how we treat IT. But again, in the spirit of convergence, segmentation tends to be one of the best ways that we can keep the attackers that are on the IT side away from the OT side. The fourth one is, let's not just believe that our trusted vendors are embracing the same level of security awareness that we are within our four walls. If you have vendors that have secure access or service accounts to update their assets, that's great. But you really need to have a unifying strategy. Each vendor does these things differently, and it's a far different set of access control than we have on the IT side. These things need to be strategically designed so that it's very obvious when there's a problem. And that takes a lot of work. You really need to do the exercises to get it right. Really enumerating your assets. And in the OT world, that's a lot of work as well. But there's no silver bullet. There's no single product that helps you with this. But you do need to really begin to track at a baseline level all of your network traffic, all of the patterns that describe baseline functionality of specific operations, and capturing the specific function codes and the process variable data that are part of those messages is the way to do that. If we look at it from the other way, the products that our vendors are supplying, very robust firewalling, IDS systems, specifically with deep packet inspection, are the ways that you're able to extract that data from the previous bullet. That's where you get the data out, and that's how you're able to establish very granular baseline information. And on top of that, you want to make sure that you have very specific industrial control system aware IDSs. And what I mean by that is you want to ensure that the specific codes for specific vendors help you describe what normal looks like. That's where you get a baseline that's of high quality, and that's where even small deviations from that baseline can help you build the alarms that'll describe what a potential attack might look like. The next two bullets I have are for folks that are using OPC, and these are a very specific set of widespread things that you want to address, but you want to be able to, at a very fine grain level, understand all of the traffic that's coming over those two UA ports and be able to know what normal looks like. Again, you want to, you can enable your logs and aggregate them across the entire asset platform to really help you manage that. And if you're turning on logging for the first time, or if you're really looking at that as a solution, which I highly recommend. You want to also build a cadence around your strategy to continually review those logs, continually refine what your baseline looks like, and continually enhance the way that you're able to pick up anomalous events. So that's my food for thought. I look forward to the panel Q&A later, and I'm going to turn it back to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blake, for sharing your perspectives with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite Mr. Paul Griswold, the Chief Product Officer for Cybersecurity Honeywell, to come on stage to share some insights on the areas involving people, process, and technology that should be considered to manage tomorrow's cyber threat detection and response. Mr. Griswold, please.
Great, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. Singapore is one of my favorite places to come. It was actually my very last trip before COVID and one of my very first trips after COVID. So I've already been here twice this year. So really, really good to be back. In my role at Honeywell, our teams have the opportunity to work with all sorts of different companies around the world with specific OT cybersecurity challenges. And every single company is at a different place in their journey. And while I'm not going to mention any company names, our legal team doesn't like that, I will be sharing some of the things that we have seen as people progress along their journey as they become more mature in their cybersecurity operations. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody at this conference that attacks are rising. Jeffrey had spoken some, Mr. Lim had spoken to some as well. So the types of attacks continue to go up every year. We are seeing an increase in attacks that are specifically targeting OT systems as well. So it's no longer just the generic attacks that are just kind of a spray and pray type of approach where you try to get in any way you can. We're seeing specific attacks designed to take advantage and break OT systems. You can see a couple of different examples here. You have everything from targeted spear phishing, you have other types of targeted attacks, and these are certainly on the rise. The need for industrial cybersecurity continues to grow as well. So especially when you look at digitalization and IT-OT convergence, some of the advantages you may have thought you've had in the past, like things being completely air-gapped or things just being offline and inaccessible, just aren't really the case anymore. And we've got a couple of stats here around organizations who experience some sort of cyber attack, the breaches that happen because of human errors. So this is either somebody who is maliciously or just accidentally doing something that is enabling some part of the attack in its chain. The attacks themselves have a pretty long dwell time, up to 2/3 of a year, 295 days. And then you also have downtime for ransomware of about 22 days. So if you think about that stat, the downtime stat for an OT production, one of the good and bad things about OT attacks is you can actually measure what that attack is costing you. If you look at an IT attack where someone has stolen some data, it's bad, but you can't really necessarily put an actual cost on what that data is worth. In an OT process, you know exactly how much money that product you're developing is making. So if you're down for 22 days, that's going to be very costly to the bottom line. If we take a look at some indicators specifically here in Asia, again, many companies are still not very up to speed on cybersecurity for OT, especially compared to their IT side. We see, many companies have impact by attacks. And when you look at when people make a decision to actually do something, it's oftentimes after the attack has happened. So it's in response to something bad that has been costly to the company. That's when they get around to actually looking for new modern solutions versus policies or other things they may have in the past. USB. So USB is one that we like to talk about a lot because in the IT world, you can pretty much disable USB. And we have this even at Honeywell with our laptops. I cannot go to my laptop and put in a storage stick and have that work. That's just been locked down by device control. You're very challenged in most cases to do this in industrial environments because the way many of these systems are updated still is with a USB key. And you also have the combination of different employees, vendors, and contractors coming in to do the updates. So whereas in the IT world, you can just lock USB down, in the OT world, you pretty much, in most cases, have to leave it on in many instances to allow the system updates. So again, if you look at some stats specifically to the Honeywell USB threat report that was just put out a couple of months ago, we're seeing an increase in attacks that are specifically designed to use removable media to get into the organization. We saw 52% last year. The previous year it was 32%. So you're seeing a pretty big increase there. Of the malware that we have analyzed, 81% was able to cause some sort of disruption to the industrial control system. So it could be a loss of view, loss of control, or something even worse. But vast majority of this malware is designed to cause some sort of harm. And of the threats that we've seen, 51%, they have some sort of capabilities to establish some sort of remote access. So you can think of in some cases, the USB threats are designed just to allow the attacker to get into the network and open up some sort of covert communication channel. Once that's open, they can do many different things through that channel, and they can get that persistence. One of the very interesting dynamics with OT versus IT is that in many cases, the IT and the OT people don't like each other. And there's often some history there. Sometimes it dates back to the IT folks with very good intentions trying to implement some sort of technology or some sort of new processes in the OT environment, and they've ended up breaking something. So if you're an operational manager or a plant manager, your bonus, your pay is typically tied to your production. So if you have systems that are going down even for a couple of hours because some new security control was put in without being properly tested, that's going to cause you some issues. So when we look at where companies are on their journeys, everyone's starting from somewhat of a different place, but we see a couple of different categories. One is companies that are very OT focused in general. So, for instance, companies that are in the pulp and paper industry or other types of manufacturing. A lot of times they'll be somewhat advanced because they think OT first. Their people in the cybersecurity department are, oftentimes OT veterans, and they're able to put into place technology and processes and procedures that are pretty well tuned to the OT environment. You can kind of contrast that with the other end of the spectrum where it's more of an IT first type of mentality. And in cases like that, a lot of times what you'll find is that IT may be responsible for the overall security, but they're not actually implementing controls. They're creating policies and guidelines and procedures and things like that. And they're giving them to the OT side of the house and really just kind of trusting that they're doing what the policies say. And then when you mix into the equation things like mergers and acquisitions, where you've acquired some new manufacturing facilities or some new plants that may be using completely different technologies, typically you're acquiring those things because of the value they produce. So your number one thing the first day is not going to be able to go in and mess around with whatever cybersecurity they may have in place. So you get all sorts of different scenarios, and everyone is in a different point on their journey. But I did want to take a minute and just kind of talk about some of the differences that we typically see between IT and OT. So if you take a look at just the first dimension, which is what the cybersecurity protects, on the IT side, it's really going to be about information. So it's going to be trade secrets, customer lists, other types of corporate information, contracts, items of that nature. So it's typically kind of on the information side. On the OT side, what you're protecting is assets and other types of process that actually produce you money. So critical infrastructure, other types of things, the type of protections there are obviously going to be very different. If you look at the impact side, so on the IT side, again, if you have a breach of data, that's going to maybe make your stock price go down. It's going to have some legal consequences, may also give a hit to your reputation, none of which are good things. On the OT side, you're talking about maybe even some more severe consequences. So not only do you have the potential economic loss for having your process be interrupted, you also have things like potential loss of life. You have environmental impact, property damage, things like that. Because the OT systems are controlling something physical. If they go haywire, it's going to have some sort of physical effect. If you look at how the operators of OT versus IT view their systems, on the IT side, again, availability and reliability is important, but you can pretty much run patches every second Tuesday of the month and have a couple of minutes downtime. You're generally able to do that type of thing. On the OT side, interruptions are just not acceptable. So even a minute of downtime can have a significant financial impacts. From a skills perspective, I don't think it's any secret that it's very difficult to fill cybersecurity jobs right now. Depending on what survey you look at, if you have one role open, you'll either have half a person or a third of a person or maybe even a quarter of a person who is able to fill that job. So you have literally negative unemployment within the IT cybersecurity world. On the OT side, you have those same challenges because you need that same type of cybersecurity skill, but you also need to find people who are familiar with the OT systems themselves. So when you think about that, you're trying to find kind of a unicorn, because you got to have someone who's really good at the security side and also understands how the security side impacts the OT process. So you have to have that domain knowledge and process knowledge and just a much wider understanding. When you look at the environments themselves, so typically IT, you have a laptop that's maybe 2 to 3 years old. It's typically running a modern operating system, running a modern processor, and you're able to install the latest cybersecurity tools on there without an issue most of the times. On the OT side, lots of Windows XP, lots of Windows 7, even some Windows NT, and even some things that may even be older than that. You're not going to be able to drop the latest EDR agent onto that type of system and have it perform well. And you're definitely not going to be able to do that and have it not impact the overall speed of the system itself. So as a result, you'll be impacting the process itself. And then finally, when you look at software and upgrades, again, on the IT side, pretty well solved problem, especially for Windows devices. And there are plenty of solutions out there that will go and help you solve your non-Windows devices. But again, a couple of minutes downtime, generally not a big deal. On the OT side, you have all sorts of different dynamics there. So even if you have a very critical patch that comes out and says, if someone exploits this zero-day vulnerability, all these very bad things can happen, it's still unlikely that someone's just going to throw that on there the next day. They're going to do an analysis of how this closing this exploit would potentially reduce their exposure. And they're also going to take a look at the compensating controls, where perhaps we have some other technology in place that we can use to buy us some time to do the patching, which we have planned for 6 months from now. So as you can see, some pretty stark differences between the two. And this is one of the primary reasons why the IT solutions can't just be dropped into the OT network and expected to work just like they do in IT. The MITRE ATT&CK framework, this is a relatively new framework the past 4 or 5 years. There's a MITRE ATT&CK framework for cybersecurity in general, and then there's also a specific one for ICS as well. And you can see 12 different dimensions or tactics that you can see there on those headers. And then below, there are over 250 techniques. This slide is actually truncated because we couldn't get it all on one slide, but you have all sorts of different entries in each one of these columns in terms of the types and impacts and methods and procedures and things like that different attacks use. And it's great because you can use this if you have the right skilled people and are collecting the right type of data to be able to map out different types of attacks onto the framework so you can understand where they're coming from, what they're going after, what the impact's going to be, and things like that. Very few companies are at the level where they can do this on the IT side effectively. Everyone kind of aspires to get there, and there's certainly some companies that are doing some very advanced work in this area. But having the skills, the processes, the technologies in place to be able to actually effectively use this is something that's still evolving. It's not very commonplace in the OT world, at least as of yet. So let's talk about early threat detection and incident response. And when you think of the front line of the people who are kind of on the receiving ends of these attacks, it's not the IT person. It's somebody who is sitting there running a process that's connected to OT systems. And the real question, and this comes down to training, is what happens when a blue screen of death comes up on one of their workstations? So I think many of you are familiar with this. I would say Windows has gotten much, much, much better, but it certainly does still happen where you'll get one of these blue screens where the system just basically halts and resets. A lot of times it's just some sort of bug, but it's also a very common thing to happen when some sort of rootkit or other type of malware is being installed. So when you see this, what would the operator do? Would he just say, oh, this is some sort of glitch, I'm not going to worry about it? Would they wait to see what happens? Would they ask an engineer? Or would they just wait for everything to come back up and just go about their daily business? The next stage of this often looks like this, where you have some sort of ransomware type of message popping up on the workstation. And again, the response to this in the OT environment could be very different than the IT environment. They could call the engineer, they could call IT, they could start pulling things out of the wall, they could start pulling out network devices, they could call law enforcement. Sometimes there's a shutdown button that they can press to discontinue the process. So this is where training comes in, is very important, because these are things that need to be contemplated and actually practiced as well. So when you're doing different types of safety drills and things like that with your OT system, this is something that needs to be considered too. So if you look at the operating challenge with OT, you have a lot of different types of data that are being produced in these environments. Typically, the OT network is smaller than the IT network, in terms of number of assets and things like that. You can have a refinery that's run by 300 or 400 assets max. So you have a lot fewer devices connected to that network than, say, you do in your corporate network where all your employees are. Even though it's smaller, the data that's produced can still be very rich. And it's also going to look a lot different than the data on the IT side. So whereas in the IT world, you're thinking of things like web access and email and things like that, OT logs just look different because the systems that are behind those logs are different. So your rules and your capabilities you have in IT just aren't going to drop right in, even if you are able to collect the data. So this is where a lot of companies, frankly struggle. Even if they have the IT side of the house very well figured out, on the OT side, the logs look different. You have trouble finding the right resources. They may not have the cybersecurity and OT expertise, maybe not monitoring 24/7. And again, maybe they haven't been doing that practice, that incident response practice to really understand what would happen in the face of an attack. So this is where proactive monitoring can significantly help reduce your cybersecurity risk. The earlier you detect a threat, the more likely you are to reduce the impact of that threat. So being able to look for not only the IOCs, the indicators of compromise are where a lot of people start. They want to know, what should I look for with my intrusion detection device? Or what should I put into my Clarity or my Nozomi or my Dragos box to actually look for these different types of attacks? In many cases, there will be some IOCs, but they'll only give you part of the problem. And more advanced attacks are going to vary a lot. So that's why a lot of these products I mentioned, as well as other products within the equation, also focus on TTPs as well. So with TTPs, you're able to actually not necessarily look for, hey, something's talking to this IP address or something has this signature, but you can get a feel for the overall tactics, techniques, and procedures that the attacker is using. And with that, if you have the right people, you can anticipate what's going to happen next and help to thwart that. Some companies do this themselves. I mean, with some of the more advanced companies we work with, they either have a very advanced security operations center where they have kind of an OT section of it, where they have the OT experts who are looking at the incoming logs and are able to analyze that in conjunction with the IT logs. Or they have separate OT SOCs that they have built out, sometimes regionally, sometimes for a particular plan even. But again, they have that OT-specific capability there. A lot of customers go to managed security service providers for this, however. Even if they're doing their IT in-house, we have several customers who will outsource their OT side to vendors like Honeywell, other type of vendors who are experts in the field. Just because, again, it's so hard to find the experts, collect the data, correlate the data, and know what to do with the data. So when you take a look at the potential threat indicators, again, on the OT network, if you're doing your segmentation properly and you've architected your network well and you have something resembling the Purdue model outlined there, then you can see that the indicators are, perhaps a little bit different. You have performance degradation. That could be an indicator. And again, that's something that can be very sensitive in an OT process. You have, a lot of situations where credentials are just maybe not managed as well as they could be. And Jeffrey's talked a little bit about this in his top 10, where you don't have the proper procedures in place for when somebody has been terminated and everyone's using the same username and password and it's been the same for the past 5 years. Obviously not a good situation. You also have things like controller changes or other types of aspects that would be unique to OT environments. On the IT side, you generally don't have a bunch of PLCs controlling anything. So we mentioned logging. So if you just take a look here, you've got kind of a variety of different logs that need to be understood. If you look at some of the best SIEM products out there, and there are a lot of really good options there, and you look at some of the statistics, especially some of the cloud-based ones, there's one that says we can search 1 trillion logs in a quarter of a second. 1 trillion logs in a quarter of a second is very, very impressive, as long as you know what you're searching for. And that's where the complications come in. You may be able to pull all this data in, until the end of the day, but if you're not really sure how to match the data up and use that to find the indicators of attacks or the TTPs, then you just have a big database of stuff that you're trying to manually go through. So, again, in OT, you're going to have things like firewalls, VPNs, and other things that are, common in the IT world as well. Then you have things like HMIs and PLCs and other types of equipment that are going to generate logs similar to their IT counterparts, but the logs are going to look a little bit different, and they're going to have slightly different fields, and they're going to have different things that you can key off that you really have to understand the log in order to be able to take advantage of. So if you take a look at just this example here, you have IP addresses. That may be where things start, and then you can map those down into the actual devices and the controllers. Pull out things like this packet here is modifying a firmware and other types of data that you can use to kind of put together the different pieces, if you have the capabilities and the skills and the people to know how to do it. So if we look at how things are evolving over time, and again, everyone is on a different point of their journey. So I'm going to go ahead and build this out here. If you're kind of early on, maybe you've got the IT side very well buttoned up, but your OT is in the process of being modernized. Most people aren't going to start with really advanced data correlation. They're just not there yet. So if you're on the fundamental side, this is where you're going to be doing things like assessments. And assessments take a couple of different forms. Asset discovery is certainly a big part of that. But there's also an aspect of physically walking around and seeing where things are connected and identifying things that look strange and a bunch of other things you can do. AV and patching, secure remote access, things like that. These are all just kind of fundamental building blocks. And then on top of that, you have kind of the people aspect as well. So you have the awareness trainings, you have the policies and procedures, and simple things like backups. Oftentimes the best solution to recovering from ransomware is a current up-to-date backup that you've actually practiced restoring in the past. So, again, we kind of consider all of those to be very fundamental. As you get into the more of the recommended type of things, this is where a regular automated asset discovery comes in. So you're able to pick up devices that may be showing up on the network for the first time. Sometimes they're legitimate. Sometimes a contractor left some sort of device plugged in that they forgot to take with them. Sometimes they're malicious. So being able to have that visibility into the changes in your network and being able to respond quickly. You have things like vulnerability scanning, USB security as well. And you also have the beginning of the data collection. So getting the data into a SIEM type of product or a managed security service provider to be able to actually do this more advanced analytics that we spoke about. And then as you get into the advanced part, this is where things like pen testing comes in, tabletop exercises, a full-blown OT SOC, either something you build yourself or something that you've outsourced to an MSSP, and being able to report on regulatory compliance. When we look at companies out there in general, I would say that most of them are probably on the left half of this chart. Most people are doing pretty well on the fundamentals, but they may have not gone all the way over to the advanced. And a lot of times that can also be tied up into an overall digitalization type of strategy and project. So people are getting there, but they're not quite there yet. when you think about advanced detection and response, a couple of key things to consider. Either if you're going to do it yourself or if you're going to outsource it to a specialist for OT managed services, a couple of different things to consider. One is, the basics. So cybersecurity 101, having some sort of moderate skills on OT cybersecurity, just to understand what you're looking at, what you're dealing with. From there, you go into the planning and justification phase. And if this is something that you're building out, this can involve, finding the physical space, getting the power pulled, getting the air conditioning put in, getting all of those other types of foundational elements there. And then you also have the people and the training and the other types of things that go to truly take advantage of the investment. From there, again, implementation and integration. So having everything stood up, having data come into it, being able to actually do something with that data. And then you go into a continuous improvement cycle as well. If you look at it from a build versus partner type of thing or perspective, certainly if you have the capabilities and you're able to hire the people and you're able to keep those people and have the budget to stand up everything you need, certainly build is an option. We tend to find that the inflection point on that is somewhere around 10 different sites. So if you're aggregating data from 2 or 3 sites, a lot of times it doesn't make sense to build out this capability yourself. It's something that we would be more cost effective with in using a managed security service provider. If you look at the outsource option, again, you can partner. You can typically get up and running a little bit quicker here because that back-end infrastructure is already there. And then there's many customers who will use kind of a combination of these two approaches. Again, maybe the IT data goes to the IT SIM and they outsource the OT SIM. Maybe they have a follow the sun type of thing where they have people in the OT SIM 12 hours of the day and they outsource it to a MSSP for the other 12 hours a day. So there are lots of different options and combinations that can also be had here for an effective strategy. We are seeing an increase in MSSPs, and I think a key thing here is that if you are using an MSSP, it's not necessarily because you can't do it in-house, it's because you have made a strategic business decision that you don't want to do it in-house. So if you think about all those challenges of the equipment and the hiring and all those other types of things, even if you could do it, you may look at it and say, this is something that's going to cost me a lot more in the long run versus outsourcing it to somebody who's going to do that for me. So using an MSSP, years ago, you used to look at it and say, oh, these guys can't handle cybersecurity themselves. They've got to outsource it. These days, that's no longer the case. It's a very business-oriented decision. And some of the most advanced companies in the world have an MSSP strategy because it makes the most sense for them. So I'll take a quick look at a case study here. So this was a company that we worked with in Spain, and they were generating about 100 million types of events per day in their OT environment. They didn't really have the capability of getting this into their IT SIM. They just didn't have the capacity. And even if they were able to do that, they didn't have the people to be able to make use of the data. So they didn't have that active monitoring. They didn't have really anything other than an IDS in place. So they were looking for help on what they needed to do next. So the solution here was an advanced monitoring and incident response type of solution where data from the environment got fed into the centralized SOC that was a managed SOC at a very high rate. You think about 100 million events in a day. That's a lot of data that's moving back and forth. But able to put that in there, have outsourced experts look at it, find those needles in the haystack, find those indicators, be able to correlate the data, and then be able to give threat notifications and response guidance back to the customer. Example of a dashboard here. This is a key thing. If you are going to use an MSSP, you don't want to rely on just having a report every 3 months of what they did. There has to be one that interaction. So when something happens, the MSSP knows who to call, and they have a relationship with the person on the other end of the phone and can work through the threats. But you also want to have that real-time visibility of what's going on as well. So having a dashboard that not only gives you the pretty graphs that are shown here, but also details. This is very important for companies, especially when there's an attack that kind of bridges from IT and OT. Being able to take the OT-specific data and correlate that with the IT-specific data becomes very important, especially during forensics and incident response. So I'll leave you with a couple of questions here at the end here in terms of what to worry about when it comes to these types of challenges. So one is the ability to find that needle in the haystack. Can you bring in all of the logs? Can you correlate them properly? Do you understand them well enough to understand what a normal log looks like versus an attack? Do you have the capabilities to perform that detection and response in-house? Do you have the OT capabilities on top of that? You're able to do it 24/7, and have you tested? So, the testing is really important. I mean, kind of an old joke is when you go do an incident response and you say, hey, do you guys have an incident response plan? They point to a dusty binder that's been on the bookshelf since 1999. That's generally not a very good incident response plan. So if you really have a proper process in place here, it's something you're testing at least on a quarterly basis, making sure roles and responsibilities are well known, making sure who does what is well known, and making sure that you actually can do this in a kind of a controlled environment so that way when the real thing happens, you're that more ready. So with that, 24 seconds to spare. I appreciate it, and I think we're going to move on to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Griswold. We're now going to be moving on to our next segment of today's program, which is our panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we encourage you to use the Slido function today. Ask our panel any questions. Feel free to scan the QR code and be part of today's conversation, whether you're in the room with us physically or whether you are joining us virtually. For our attendees in the room as well, we're going to be having mics, so feel free to approach the mics and ask our panel any question that you desire. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our moderator for today, Mr. Andre Shourie, the Chief Information Security Officer, Apex Schneider Electric. Mr. Shourie, please. Also joining us on the panel, Mr. Jeffrey Blake, Global Head of Solutions Engineering, Nozomi Networks. Mr. Blake, please. Mr. Michael Lagana, Principal Solution Engineer, APJ Clarity. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Paul Griswold back on stage, Chief Product Officer for Cybersecurity, Honeywell. Mr. Shourie, stage is all yours.
Thank you, Charmaine. And a special thank you as well to CSA for once again hosting an amazing Cybersecurity Week. It's through dialogues and open discussion like this that we really help to advance our profession and discipline. Let me just do a quick recap of the panelists up here with me. I did a little bit of research, a little bit of background research on each of them. So starting with Paul, I found out that Paul is based in Atlanta, where of course he's responsible for Honeywell's cybersecurity software, managed services and consulting services portfolios. So I also found out that Paul's career spans almost 30 years, beginning in 1995. He has an MBA and is a computer science graduate from the prestigious Georgia Institute of Technology. And of course, Honeywell, Paul's employer, is also a global manufacturer of industrial OT and IoT systems. And Paul is responsible for the security of all of those. So welcome, Paul. Thank you for being here. Paul, you've been with Honeywell as their Chief Product Security Officer for the past 2 years. And before that, I dug out that you're also at IBM as an executive director for almost a decade, focusing on their threat intelligence and intrusion protection systems. So how has your threat intelligence background aided you? And what insights can you share on the threat intelligence and intrusion protection in the OT cybersecurity world?
First of all, I want to challenge you on the 30 years, but I think you're actually right. So we'll move on from that. So with the threat intelligence, when I moved over to Honeywell at the beginning of January 2020, I knew that the OT cybersecurity was going to be different than IT cybersecurity. It was even more different than I expected. And when you look at it from the lens of threat intelligence, on the IT side, the threat intelligence is I would say, pretty rich. You have some pretty good firms out there that are doing research and have some good ideas of some of who the actors are. I think there's a lot of opportunity on the OT side to expand that, and certainly there are companies that are doing that. Two of the people on the panel here, they have some very good work in that and research in that area. But I think that OT still is not quite as rich as IT. So I think that's a great opportunity.
Okay. And do you think that with increased in threat intelligence and open knowledge sharing and threat intelligence exchange as well, that will actually improve our cybersecurity posture in the OT world, potentially beyond the IT?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the sharing component especially. So when you look at attackers, and if you've ever been on the dark web or some of these message boards, I mean, there are people sharing stuff all the time. And we've made great strides there, especially with ISACs. So ISACs are intelligence sharing communities that are often dedicated to certain industries. So you'll have an ISAC that's specifically to oil and gas. You'll have one for electric power and things like that. That is certainly, again, something that has evolved over the past few years. And I think once we get to the point as practitioners and defenders where we're as comfortable sharing information as attackers are, that'll be a very good day.
Fantastic. I'd also like to welcome Michael Lagana to this panel discussion and OT cybersecurity conversation. So Michael, of course, hails to us from Clarity, where he's been their Asia Pacific Principal Solutions Engineer. So with over 20 years experience in engineering, Michael is on the front lines of customer cybersecurity risks and challenges within industrial and critical infrastructure organizations every day. I'm really glad to have him on today's panel as well. So Michael, you work with a broad range of customers out there, and you help design practical solutions to help them gain better insights and visibility into their OT environments. In other words, you're in the trenches with them every day, helping them to defend themselves. So what's the reality on the ground for most organizations? What are some of the biggest challenges that organizations face in improving their OT cyber capabilities? And maybe you can share with us some of the success stories or maybe even some of the pain points that you might have through your experiences.
Yeah, thanks. So working directly with customers is a privilege that we have because we get to see those challenges firsthand. Most of the time, and if you look at Gartner will tell us that the majority of our customers are in an awareness phase of cybersecurity for OT. What that means is basically there's more than half of you out there are just looking at OT cybersecurity as an awareness piece. You're not in the phase of your journey to be able to execute on a program that you're looking to build. The remaining, I think it's around 30 to 35% are in a visibility phase, which means that only really leaves 10% of our organizations in the field that are at a point where they can actually execute and extract maximum value in some of the solutions that Paul was talking about in deep analytics and executing on programs and building playbooks and all of these effective mechanisms that helps you address the actual problem you're trying to solve. So the biggest challenge we find when we start talking to these customers is they say, I don't know what I have, so I don't know what to protect. So it's very important that when we're talking to customers, we understand where they are on their OT cybersecurity journey. Because if we don't, and we start offering solutions and playbooks and services to the customer that they're not in a maturity state to receive and consume, then the tools that we're offering and the services we provide are ineffective and they're very hard to deliver. So when we take a step back and we really understand where the customer is on their journey, we can then target our focus onto what exactly is going to work for you today. You will have a plan that says you want to execute X up to this point, maybe in 6 months, and then you've got a 1-year plan and potentially a 3-year plan. So ensuring that we understand where you are along your journey enables us as OT vendors to help you secure your environments, to offer you the right solutions and the right technologies that are going to address the problems you have today and give you the ability to be able to address the problems you want to be able to achieve in 3 years' time or next year.
And just going back to being in the trenches and helping customers in their journey here. So any insights to share in terms of, maybe a particular segment that's a little bit more mature, or, are there other segments that you see that really need to up their game?
Yeah, especially in our region, in Asia Pacific, we're seeing a lot of mining and power gen utilities that are relatively mature in their journey. They'll have a SOC. They may not have a dedicated OT SOC, as Paul mentioned, but they will definitely have an IT SOC, and they're looking to bring that convergence for IT and OT SOC together. One of the biggest challenges I think that we have is there's a lot of difficulty on the customer side to get buy-in from the security level, so the IT, OT security level, where the CISOs and the business is pushing for some sort of resolution or some solutions to a problem, down into the actual weeds, back onto the actual plant itself. And so what we're finding is, even once we're providing some capability and some solutions to these organizations, there's a disconnect between the SOC, let's say, the higher level security, and the actual operations. And as we've talked about and identified earlier today, it's critical that we don't stop operations. A security incident in OT needs to come back down to the plant or the site that it's applicable to, and there needs to be a collaboration. There needs to be context as to what has happened, so that when we make decisions on how we resolve or mitigate or put in compensating controls for the future, we're doing something that's going to be effective. So we often see there's a huge gap. There's a big gap between what the IT and the IT, the CISO, the business is looking to achieve, and fundamentally the gap to back right down to the specific sites and operations teams that are actually supporting those systems.
Thanks, Michael. I'd like to now turn to Jeff, our keynote speaker from today. So Jeff, of course, you're the Global Head of Sales Engineering at Nozomi Networks. And with over 25 years of sales engineering experience, including 13 years at Splunk. That's quite impressive, fantastic. I also found out that you're licensed by the US Department of Homeland Security on industrial control systems. So very impressive. Jeff, I also believe that you and Paul know each other fairly well. You've also presented together at the last one was the Honeywell Users Group in Orlando in May, right? So yeah, it's great that you guys can tour the world together. It's brilliant. You also addressed some of the prominent emerging challenges in the OT cybersecurity space at that conference. Would you mind sharing with the audience today, in your opinion, what are some of the top emerging challenges for OT cybersecurity, and why are they your top choices?
Yeah, you could spend the whole conference talking about that. It's, I think the biggest challenges are the dynamics in the way that the attacks are manifesting, and the nation states that are delivering on them, and the huge amount of resources that are behind those forces to make them become the challenges that are very almost insurmountable for people on the defense. So Paul talked a bit about how we would aggregate our resources for that. I think there's probably I don't know where to start with this, but that I'll let some of the other guys chime in.
But you mentioned, before we go to the other guys, you mentioned nation states, which is very, very interesting. So have we actually seen any evidence or indicators, strong indicators that some of these attacks are really nation state? Because it seems like most of the attacks are financially motivated, right? They're trying to ransomware you, they're trying to disrupt your operations because they know that every second is costing you thousands of dollars. Yeah. But a nation state really takes that to a whole different level. So maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think there was sort of a continuum that developed over the last decade or so, and where you were mentioning ransomware and a lot of the very specific takes on theft and fraud and things. Those are I think we've learned over time, you guys can support me if this is correct or not, but I think those are much more aligned with criminal activity and not so much with the nation state. I think the nation state programs that are really pushing hard are those that are doing massive disruption, like the elections that we've had, the recent elections in the US and in other countries, and much more campaign level disruption, I think, would be the way to
I'd
put
agree
that.
with that. I mean, I think when you look at the difference between the, say, cyber criminals versus nation state, cyber criminals, they deploy ransomware, they make money off of it, they make a living off of it. I mean, some of them actually have pretty nice offices where people go in and work. I mean, but it's truly a way of financing a criminal enterprise. The nation state stuff, I think, is a lot more scary because a lot of times vulnerabilities will be discovered and just put it in your back pocket and save it for later when it might be needed as part of an overall warfare type of campaign.
Right, I think we've seen a little bit of that in Eastern Europe this year, right? Yep. Where campaigns were actively launched that were planted years ago, which was very interesting.
Yep, it's been reported.
Yeah, just it's a great point, and one of the scary things about nation state is it's very targeted. So maybe that's to a degree a positive for us. We might know when there's a conflict like the conflict we have at the moment in Europe, where both sides, I guess, will be on high alert, right? We'll be looking for these attacks to be coming through. What we're still seeing a lot of, though, is a lot of threat bleed from IT coming through with that new IT-OT convergence that's coming through, the digitization of all of our assets, the Industry 4.0, extended IoT, which really just brings connectivity right down to the lower levels of the Purdue stack that Jeff was talking about. And so one of the most common, I guess, detections we're seeing, especially in Australia and New Zealand, is ransomware. And it's bled through from IT breaches. So having that visibility of the ingress-egress between that connectivity of OT and IT is really going to help us to curtail, I guess, some of those big ransomware attacks that are happening. And like you say, they're there to make money. That's all they're there for.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the Colonial Pipeline example from, it was earlier this year, maybe it was late last year. I live in the southeastern part of the US, so we were one of the states where it took a while for us to get gas for about a week or so. And if you read the information that's been published on that attack, they didn't actually get to the OT systems, but they got to the billing systems. So rather than attack the process itself, you attack how you get paid for the process. And again, if you're a criminal organization, that's just as effective. You're probably going to get your money that way.
There's a lot more vulnerabilities at that IT level than there is potentially down at a segmented, isolated OT level network. Sure. So they'll target their attacks to where they know they've got a higher chance of getting in, and then potentially sit there for a while, like an APT attack, and then when the time is right, sort of, and we've seen that in different...
Yeah. IT vulnerabilities are enormous and represent a huge surface. But to your point, Paul, with Continental, whoever the attackers were, mission accomplished, because even though they didn't get to the OT side, management made the decision to shut down the OT side as a retroactive act to protect that side of the network. And so even without a breach, they were able to cause massive disruption and a cold winter for Paul.
Yeah. But that's an interesting statement that you made that, on the surface, and I agree with you on the surface, that the IT side definitely appears to have more vulnerabilities than the OT side. But also thinking about patching cycles and getting that once a year maintenance window if you're lucky. Do you think it's maybe more, or could it potentially be more that attackers are finding it just easier because the vulnerabilities are really on the perimeter of the IT side, and OT, you got to breach the perimeter to get into that soft, chewy middle bit. But maybe might be even more vulnerabilities because you haven't patched in 2-3 years.
Yeah, I can start with that one. So, I mean, I think that you're right. I mean, when you look at the attack surface on the IT side, it's much broader, right? So, you know, but at the same time, you do have probably a more high likelihood of having less vulnerabilities just because you're able to apply patches more. I mean, I think when we look at the OT side, you know, some of the most basic hygiene can really go a long way. So, like Jeff had talked about with doing zero trust and zoning and things like that, I mean, if you have very specific rules on what can talk to what, that's generally pretty effective. If you're doing the identity and access control, that's generally pretty effective. So you're right. I mean, I think it is, you know, once you get in there, there's probably, you know, a field day of vulnerabilities that have been out there for 2 or 3 years, but I also think you have a better opportunity to prevent that access from happening in the first place.
Thank you.
I think the business of cyber in IT is much more mature than it is in OT. You can count the number of vendors that supply IT products versus the ones that supply OT cyber products. And what probably correlates heavily with that is the number of criminal enterprises that automate hacking and facilitate breaching on the IT side. So anybody can get on the internet and buy you know, threats as a service or any number of toolkits to get into the IT side, where I don't think we've matured to that level that there's enough of that content out there on the OT side.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think one of the key points of having many of our, even excluding our IT assets being on the boundary or above OT, we're seeing a lot more traditional IT assets and IT roles inside the operations network, and that, again, it's a difference between OT and ICS. So we have IT-based assets now, in today's day and age, controlling and managing ICS. So those assets inherently bring extra risk. And so the attackers know that Windows will have vulnerabilities, for example. So what we need to be looking to address, I guess, is where do those assets reside, gain visibility of those assets, understand their risk posture, and then either patch where we can, and we know we can't patch right down to the lower levels of assets in ICS because they're legacy systems and for many other reasons, but patch where we can and put in segmentation, compensating controls for the I guess the vulnerabilities that we cannot patch. And I guess that's somewhere where we can really enhance, and it's not trivial, but at the same time, it's not overly complicated because we have a very good understanding of our IT systems and our vulnerabilities on the IT network, and we can sort of transition that down and cover more of our assets lower down the Purdue.
Thank you. Paul, I was watching your presentation earlier, and you touched on many interesting things to bear in mind when rolling out OT cybersecurity. But I also noted that we often divide cybersecurity into, you know, most of practitioners in this room, I think, just divide cybersecurity into 2 major segments, IT and OT, right? But you mentioned that ICS is not OT, right? There is a differentiation. So I suspect many of the audience would like a little bit more clarification on how you define OT versus ICS. If you could help expand on that, just so that there's alignment and better understanding and deeper understanding.
Yeah, I think this is actually from your presentation, Jeffrey, so you want to...
I'd be happy to.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So my definition of OT is the superset of anything that would be part of a network, which would include ICS as a subset. So industrial control systems, SCADA networks, all of the industrial assets would be, I would classify those as part of the ICS component. The superset includes all of the switch level networks and all of the potentially any of the equipment that would represent DMZ and on into the IT. That can be, that's what I would define as the OT network, sort of the superset.
Okay. And actually, on the heels of that, I'm just wondering, is there any kind of framework or metrics or matrix that maybe has different systems and different classifications, and then and then maybe have a little bit of different protection or defense mechanisms that you should focus on, different priorities. Is that kind of mechanism out there yet?
I don't think down to that level from what we've seen. We can definitely understand the asset from the Purdue level. The Purdue level gives us an ability to represent an asset and how it resides in the whole OT network based on its function in the physical process. So from that, we can then understand, because of the role that it has and the actions that it takes on the physical network, we can understand what to do to protect it. So for example, part of a question we have coming up later on is, if we've got an asset that is a sensor or an actuator or a pump, which is a physical device on the plant, on the site, it may not have an IP address. So there's no point trying to put in some segmentation work on a device that is non-IP based. So we do have that knowledge today. We can classify those assets in that way. And then from there, we can then build in the appropriate controls to try and secure them as best as we can. Things like ensuring that those devices are shipped, and then when they're deployed, they're not just using default passwords. They're not using clear text passwords. These are the small steps we can take right down to that level, knowing the type of device it is, exactly what's going to protect us from day one with very minimal effort. And for example, default passwords is a big one for ICS devices, level 0, level 1.
Right.
I think the question of frameworks is a good one. So, when we look at, our customer sites, you'll find some similarities, but everyone is almost a snowflake, right? I mean, every site's doing something slightly different, so it's going to have some unique characteristics. I think the Purdue model is a great way of looking at, where do you put in your segmentation, where do you limit traffic and things like that. We also, the other two frameworks that we typically will use will be that MITRE ATT&CK framework for ICS. That's a great one when you're actually doing a detection and response type of thing. From a strategy perspective, we often will use the NIST cybersecurity framework, pretty well-known framework. And if you look at it, it's very simplistic to the point where it's just beautiful in that you can get it to apply to an IT and OT network equally well. So when you look at the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, you're going to have some slight differences on the OT side, but they all fit into those categories pretty well. So it could be very helpful for helping customers understand exactly what control goes to what problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah. I'll pile onto the NIST framework. That's probably the most widely embraced, at least in the US. It is a US standard, but as far as a global standard, I don't think there's anything out there. Our most mature customers of ours, they're refining a model that looks, you've got an asset inventory, and then you've got a list of potential vulnerabilities against all those, and that's really sort of the holy grail, is merging those two, so that in real time you can see what your risk exposure really looks like.
Right. Thanks, Jeff. I'd like to open up to the questions to the audience. There's a few microphones set up in the room. Please feel free, put up your hand and jump up. We've been satisfying my curiosity this whole time. I'd really like to encourage the audience to reach out and pop some questions out and satisfy your curiosity today. I'd also take a look at the online questions, but if anyone in the room might have something that was on their mind that they'd like to ask about OT cybersecurity. If not, let me go to the questions on Slido. So up first, David Ong is asking a question, and I'm not sure if it's queuing up, but it's about with more countries mandating data cloud to be localized due to data and privacy protection laws, how can OT, SOCs, or managed service providers circumvent this challenge if managed OT assets are spread across borders?
I can start with that one. This is, I'm chuckling because this is an acute problem. When you look at the regulations, and it truly is almost a country by country type of analysis that we have to do. In some cases, if you look closely at the regulation, it has to do with data residency, but the people analyzing the data can be remote. In other cases, the data, the people, everything has to be localized into that country. So there's not a one-size-fits-all answer on this one, unfortunately. I mean, it truly is country by country. And the way we look at that as Honeywell is it really depends on demand and business case. So, you know, whereas it may be very easy to justify setting up a SOC in one area of the world because there are lots and lots of potential customers there, you know, in a smaller country that has very strict data regulations, we're probably more likely to partner with somebody locally to provide that service.
I think I'll add to that I guess you can also, and there are GPDR in Australia and New Zealand, for example, there's FIRB regulations with Foreign Investment Review Board, which mandates data within country and also people within country. I guess from a high-level management of your overall business, which, as we say, can be definitely global. And we work with many customers that don't just have sites in Australia, have some sites in Australia, and then the majority are spread across Southeast Asia and even some in Europe. What that means is when we're monitoring those systems for those customers, we need to securely give them access to the metadata in the cloud, potentially, if it's required by them, and also meet these exact regulations. If it's an MSSP, it falls on the MSSP. If it falls on the OT vendor as a SaaS offering, which we have, it'll be in-country. So if we're pushing out monitoring capabilities to an organization that has sites globally, then the data within each of those geos will stay in that geo from a visibility point of view.
Jeff, did you want to weigh in on that as well?
I don't think I could add much more than what Michael said, but I have never run across a customer that really wanted detail level data from one region to be merged with another region. It's pretty well defined by country, as Paul points out. I think the bigger challenge is getting cloud-based services in some regions of the world where it just now today does not exist, and the resistance to embracing the infrastructures that are out there today are challenged.
Yep, I absolutely agree. In fact, I was just about to raise a point about cloud as well. Definitely with more analytics happening and centralized management happening as well, I think that cloud-enabled services may also be the direction in the future for a lot of OT cybersecurity systems, or OT networks rather. And so how do you imagine we're going to be able to really effectively protect that? Because now you're really seeing the OT and IT system becoming, you know, essentially a single organism. So, and we all know about all the cloud breaches. I mean, there was a recent one, Michael, as you're aware, in Australia with Optus, which is cloud related as well, right? Isn't that really a step that has to be taken very, very carefully, or are companies just rushing to embrace cloud a little bit too quickly?
No one's rushing. The customers that I have that are tentative about it are not rushing. And I think to Michael's point, the big piece to emphasize is you can manage a widespread, you know, multi-region area by using the metadata. So it's a matter of awareness, and it's a matter of educating people that we're not exporting data out of the borders. We're not taking critical data or personal data out of country. We're sending up metadata to help manage and to help defend in terms of it that way.
I mean, a couple of thoughts on that particular. So if you look in the IT world, the IT world's generally ahead of the OT world. I mean, I can remember in my previous role speaking with the CISO of a major airline, and 2 years prior to this conversation, she had said, "We're never moving to the cloud, ever. It's just a corporate decision. We're never moving to the cloud." 2 years later, she's like, "We're moving everything to the cloud." and really what the inflection point was the cost and the capabilities. So it was cheaper to put things in the cloud, and you got better capabilities, faster capabilities that solve your problem in a more efficient manner. So on the OT side, I think that we'll get there, and I think the difference between people who will be earlier adopters versus maybe later on have to do with whether or not the process that they're supporting is a revenue generator or a cost. So, if you look, I'll just make up an example here. If you look at, for instance, like a connected car, that's probably going to be cloud first. And connected cars are driving the revenue of automobile manufacturers. So there's probably more likely to move to the cloud there because you're moving so quickly and you're generating revenue off of that. If you look at maybe some older types of manufacturing where it's really more of an optimization type of mode there, they're probably not going to be as likely to move to the cloud anytime soon just because they won't get the benefit from it.
Yeah, 100% agree. And it's one of the challenges we've seen in the last 18 months to 2 years is we've had exactly that same. There's a lot of hesitancy in OT to move to cloud, fully understandable. But then we've seen a transition to see more and more organizations being open to discussing cloud. It's not a matter of, we shouldn't be asking the question to the customers about, are you open to cloud? We should be asking the questions around, again, where are you on your journey? Do you have scope to run a system that's going to take all the complexity away from you and put it back onto the service provider, put it back onto the OT vendor to say, well, we will take care of all of that for you and we'll offer to you as a service, which is what we're starting to do now with our customers across this region and globally at Clarity. So it's, I don't think it's an effective method to talk to customers about do you support cloud or not, because there will be varying different systems that will leverage cloud and things that will not leverage cloud. It's more about where are you on your journey and does it fit into your current journey, and if it does, when are you looking to achieve that? And we can help you with that, yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's probably different layers too. Like, I mean, for instance, if I look at the products that I've planned for our portfolio, there's not one single thing that will be only cloud. So there'll always be an on-prem type of option and an on-prem sensor or what have you to be able to collect data. Now, there could be options where if you want certain capabilities, you really need to have the cloud version. But for OT, I mean, I don't think we're going to be in a situation where it's all cloud all the time anytime soon.
Yeah, interesting. And I think it has a little bit to do with which particular segment of OT we're talking about as well. So I was thinking while you were speaking about BMS systems, for example, right? A lot of that analytics about when's the optimal time to replace an air filter is something that maybe can be sent. And there's also that economy of scale as well, because you need to compare that data with something else, right? It's not just about when's the best time in that particular building to replace an air filter, but when's the best time across all the buildings in a particular country or a particular region to replace an air filter. That data is also relevant in terms of the intelligent decision making, right? So I think that has a lot to do with it. But definitely secure systems where uptime becomes, production, industrial controls, industrial automation systems, for example, I would absolutely agree.
Yeah, I might add BMS systems is large scale, right? Massive scale. And for cloud, operational efficiency for these types of devices is critical. It's almost as important than the security itself, because if the device falls over because it needs to be upgraded and we've missed that life cycle management, we've got a big problem. When it comes to BMS, take Marina Bay Sands, for example, is massive, right? The amount of IoT devices that would be connected around this building would be astronomical. So having a cloud service that would be able to effectively manage not only the security of those devices, but also the operational efficiency of those devices and the lifecycle management gives you a kind of a different approach to protect that asset as well, outside of cyber. So the cloud really has some additional capabilities that you may not have with an on-prem solution, for example.
I think that's actually a really good, interesting point too. If you think of BMSs and predictive maintenance types of use cases, or even manufacturing, I think there certainly is the opportunity for cyber type of guidance to come in with maintenance type of guidance. So if you think about a package sorter, those things have conveyor belts on them that just go out. So the conveyor belt may need a 30-minute downtime to all the things being replaced. You can imagine systems in the future that will be able to say, during that 30 minutes, you should apply these two patches because they're going to give you the most bang for your buck, solve your most pressing vulnerabilities, and just kind of combine the workflows for the two.
Fantastic. We have a question from the floor. Do you think it's worth the effort going into level 0 or 1, I'm assuming the Purdue model, for non-IP device monitoring after implementing solutions like Clarity and Nozomi. So I guess that's going to be directed to you guys first, but we'll weigh in on the Purdue model later.
You kind of touched on that already, Michael. It's, you know, philosophically, as much data as you can get to help represent what might be an anomaly or any sort of negative impact to your operations, I think that's key. How you do that at that level is probably running into some device dependencies and things like that. But yeah, do you have more to?
Totally agree. I guess to answer the question directly is yes, 100%. It's worth going down to that level. Those assets are important, if not the most important devices in the ICS network, period. Mainly because they are directly affecting the physical process. So having visibility of those assets, again, it sets that foundation for you to build further programs of security. Without that visibility, how do you protect those assets, whether they're IP-based or not? So 100%, I think it's worth going down to that level. And we have ways to get down there, so that's no problem.
And another question from Flora, just bookending to what you just said, Michael. With the increase in smart IoT sensors, so again, towards that visibility, used in OT installations, what are the challenges and takeaways in terms of controlling and monitoring such sensors against attacks?
I can start if you like.
Open to anyone.
Yeah,
Please,
I'll just go briefly first. So from a smart sensor, IoT sensor device point of view, challenge and takeaway, it's understanding the profile of the device. The challenge is understanding its normal operating behavior. Once we know that, and once we have solutions in place like ours, OT monitoring, and IoT monitoring in place, we can baseline. We can build compliance frameworks for the communication behavior, and we can measure that 24/7. Any deviation from that, we can then start triggering alerts. We can just generate tracking, so we can visualize what traffic is deviating, for example, for one of these sensors. And then we can even take it to the next step, again, thinking about that journey on where the customer is. If you're up to level 4 of your journey and you want to start doing blocking of traffic, you can then take that intelligence and feed it into your firewalls and start actioning security on those IoT sensors, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just give a personal example, and you can kind of contrast it to a building like this. But in my house, it's just me and my wife. We don't have any kids. We have 80 devices with IP addresses on them. And that's, if you look at, the home automation and smart TVs and tablets and Apple TVs and all the other things, it's pretty quick to get up to 80. And if you multiply that by, say a door sensor on every door in this building, you're easily into the thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands. So I think one of the interesting things about IoT devices in particular is just the sheer number of them and the amount of data that they produce. So back to the previous point we talked about what's going to kind of be a tipping point to move to cloud. I think that is going to be one, because as you have more and more of these things deployed, it's just going to be a lot harder for you to have an on-prem solution to manage them all. The other thing I'll mention about this is that when you look at these devices, obviously you're not going to be able to put an agent on them. It's really network monitoring is what you're going to be able to do. And hopefully you're able to do that on clear text traffic sometimes, and especially more advanced devices, they use encrypted traffic, so you got to use special approaches on that. But a common approach on this is just doing simple password rotation, where you're not just putting in the default password. That's kind of like step 1. But step 2 is having an automated procedure in place where you are changing out the password every 30 days with some sort of identity management capability.
I think this represents an enormous challenge for organizations. I'll piggyback off a couple things you both said. Definitely the size and the scope. I mean, if you're talking about a factory floor, the OT guys know there's a finite number of assets. They know exactly where everything is. Nothing is moving around per se, and it's complicated to manage, but it's very very well bounded in terms of the finiteness of it. To Paul's point, if we do a lot of smart cities work with those kinds of operations, and there's an infinite number of connections that could be made, and planning for a very high number of unknown things is a huge challenge, not just from a capacity perspective, but also from a security perspective. And so those are troubling in terms of how do we approach this. I think that's very different for the OT folks to manage, and because a lot of these protocols are IP based with IoT, and because it's cloud, to your point, Paul, a lot of that management's going into the IT security folks, and they're not prepared for it either. So it's who's going to own it and who's going to really embrace this. These are big things to think about.
And I very interesting point raised as well in terms of home ownership and all the IoT that's coming into our homes as well. And I know this is a little bit outside of industrial OT systems, but I think that when it comes to cybersecurity and why we do cybersecurity, it's important for people to understand, what's the personal impact, right? How does this impact you? If a factory goes down and the widget that you want to buy is delayed for 2 months, that's an inconvenience. But if an attacker's in your house, that's a very, very different story, I think, right? 100%. So do you think that there might actually be a opportunity or perhaps a need, and again, this is being proactive, but a need to actually start thinking about how to protect commercial or private IoT networks, because essentially you have an IoT network in your house nowadays, right? I mean, your phone's an IoT device, so you've had it for years, and most people don't realize that. But when you think about, the average home router right now, it just does like stateful traffic, kind of very basic filtration and things like that. Doesn't understand OT protocols in any shape or sense, and has no ability to really do anything with that smart light bulb. So, what are some of the things that are needed, or what can the owners do today, or what can we do tomorrow?
So, I mean, I can comment on that a little bit in terms of what I do with my own house. It kind of goes back to the basics. So using VLAN, so things can't talk to each other, they can't get out to the internet except under very certain configurations. But I've been in technology for 30 years, so I know how to do this. If you look at someone like my mom, she's not going to know how to do that. So I think there's an opportunity, and I think in terms of who is going to address that opportunity, I think it will be kind of the home security system type of people, and even maybe some of the other people providing services like internet and the things like that. And it'll essentially be a managed service. It won't be a managed service like we think of it in the industrial world, but I definitely think that there is a gap there. And I think if you look at some of the kind of the more scary stories about people finding just open cameras with default passwords on Shodan and using it to see what's going on in like a baby's room. I mean, there are many instances of that out there. So I think it definitely is an opportunity for somebody.
David Ong submitted a question. He asks, some argue that regulation encourages asset owners to do the minimum to comply, whereas without regulations, are there incentives to do better due to the mutual interest in protecting assets, preventing disruption, and protecting reputation? Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Would you agree or disagree that, I think David's asking, should we have more incentives?
Incentives are always good, sure. I'm not exactly sure how we would start with that, but to address the first part of the statement, compliance does drive a lot of organizations to shoot for the minimum bar and stay there. But I can also point to, and you guys can back me up, I think our most mature organizations are the ones that have heavy regulations and have imposed a lot of compliance by industry, and that's really lifted all, rising tide lifts all boats kind of concept. I think that's my experience.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think, there's obviously a difference between being compliant and being secure. Jeffrey and I were actually just talking before the thing. once had a cybersecurity host-based product that I used to manage, and we were pulling the product from the market. And we went to a customer and we said, this isn't going to be updated anymore. And they said, I don't care. I said, why don't you care? And they said, we just need to have it on. If it's on, we're compliant. It doesn't need to be up to date. It doesn't need to be looking for anything. But if we have it installed and on, then we're compliant. We don't have to worry about it. So I think you're right. I mean, I think there are certainly a bare minimum when it comes to compliance that you can do and maybe raise your cybersecurity posture up a bit. And some things have more teeth than others. But ultimately, I don't think you can rely on just being compliant to say, yes, I'm also secure.
Yeah, I'll add also to that with, in terms of regulation, it's definitely, it's a great point that's raised. We do see a lot of evidence of organisations just trying to tick boxes, but ultimately at the end of the day, there's two things that are happening. The first thing is their underlying, interest and incentive to protect their assets in the first instance should still be the same, whether there's regulation or not. The second thing I'd say is that, especially in Australia and New Zealand, is we're seeing the government enforcing more compliance and regulation that has, how would I describe it? Some sort of responsibility for you to address, and if you don't address and you get audited, then you do not comply, even though you have ticked the box. So I think governments are starting, especially in Australia, and this is where the Security Act has really taken a big step forward in the last 12 to 18 months, specifically when the SOCI Act came out, was that people were ticking boxes. So now they've sort of steered the regulation in a way to start saying we need mandatory risk management systems put in place that are documented. And you need to show evidence that you have them. So I guess it takes away that you're not just ticking a box anymore, you actually do have to have regulation and evidence. So I think more and more governments will probably end up doing that to encourage organisations to go the whole mile.
And of course, keeping in mind that compliance with regulators is the minimum cybersecurity that you need to do. So I think if you have a mature cybersecurity program or you do have a serious approach to cybersecurity, you should be ticking those boxes automatically anyways and going beyond that. Right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
And if you're a critical infrastructure organisation, you are mandated. You are providing a critical service to the community, so you must comply. There's no option, really. If you fall in that vertical, you fall in those verticals, within critical infrastructure, you must comply. It's a regulation, yeah.
Again, would encourage anyone in the audience, please grab a microphone, throw the questions up there, or Slido as well is available to you. A couple of questions back from me. Thinking about people, process, and technology, where would you invest? Where would you invest? Thinking about OT systems, OT networks, OT infrastructure, smart factories, where's how would you prioritize those three? I won't say which one would you only throw money in because you need all three, but how would you prioritize that?
It's always people. They're uninformed, unaware staff are your biggest vulnerability. I don't care what else you've invested in. That has to be the top priority. And then just general awareness, how the operations align with security, and as you mature, making sure that the training, the awareness, and that becomes programmatized and rolled out as a function of the improvement.
Yeah, I'd agree 100% with that. I mean, I think process and technology are driven by people. So, ultimately, you can have the latest gadgets and things like that in there, but if you don't have the people in there to tune them and make them make sense, and the processes to do something when they actually turn something up, then you're not going to get very far.
Yeah, I would also 100% agree with that, except I would also say one of the key things that can help us understand the types of processes we should be implementing and the types of people we need is visibility. So we have a full understanding of the complete picture of our OT environment. Now we know what we need to do and who we need to do it. So whilst people and process, I think, are the two most important pieces, I don't know if then technology maybe should come in front just for that awareness phase, just for that visibility phase to say, right, now we know where we stand, now we can implement the right people and the right processes because we have the visibility.
And just to bookend, and just to add on to all the excellent comments today, I think as a CISO myself, when resource becomes a constraint, when you don't have the people and you don't have the time to wait for the people to develop and have that talent pipeline, then you're back to technology. So you end up investing money in technology, only to realize that you still need people to operate it.
Exactly.
So it's a little bit of a cycle.
Yes.
It is.
Okay. I wanted to touch on zero trust, and I hope we can do this quickly, because I also have another question about just looking forward to the future. But what do you see the role of zero trust playing in the OT network? I know it's been bandied around, and people, it's so hard to roll out zero trust in the IT world as it is. And this is beyond segmentation, of course. This is really about authentication between devices. But do you really think that zero trust is the right direction to go? And do these devices really need to authenticate against each other? I mean, in the OT environment, how many devices really do talk to each other? Leaving aside, IoT for now, which is the sensor network on top of that, but really your production lines, your building control systems.
So I can start with that one. So if you look at the life cycle of OT environments, especially something like oil and gas, then you're talking 20, 30 years between refreshes. So during a refresh, absolutely, you should be looking at a secure network design that includes zero trust principles. To the extent that the devices support it, is a very good point. Even if you're doing a refresh, it doesn't mean that the devices that you're refreshing with are brand new. I mean, oftentimes it could be older technology that you rely on, and it just doesn't support zero trust. But I think it is something that you should do when you are able to. I would not advocate taking something that's 10 years into its 20-year life cycle and ripping it out just to put in zero trust. But I do think it's a part of a fundamental building block on a new type of system being deployed.
Yeah, I think zero trust as a principle is a great principle. The reality of zero trust in ICS is not trivial. It's not as easy as we would like to hope it is, and it's not as easy to deploy. However, that doesn't mean there's no place for it. It's definitely something we should be focusing on, and there are parts of our ICS and our OT environments that we can 100% effectively employ a zero trust principle segment. But there's a time and a place for it, and the biggest challenge we have is where we can implement zero trust. And that's what we're finding with our customers is a lot of them are saying, yes, we understand that the principle of zero trust. In reality, it can't happen in my environment. So we as OT security vendors need to revisit that and really understand how we can do more in that space. We are doing some good stuff, especially around remote access and stuff like that with zero trust, but we can do way more, and we need to work on that, I think, for the future, I guess.
Yeah, agree 100%. As a principle, as an architecture or design principle, it's great. If you're talking to a vendor about zero trust, it means there's a new version of their product they want you to buy. And there's probably a dozen things, like I said at the beginning of my talk, that you can do that are going to make your environment much more robust before you start getting into the next new thing.
I think that with zero trust as well, very often we think about confidentiality and integrity, right? The availability kind of comes in at the end, whereas in the OT system, it's the opposite, it's backwards. Availability is number one. So if your device doesn't authenticate to the next device down the line and talk to it, what does that do to your availability, right? So that is a big challenge.
Yeah, it's hard to get right. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. I'm holding the future question. Well, you know what? I'm just going to throw it out. I'm going to throw it out right now. So in your opinion, what do you imagine might be the next big technological development in OT and IoT cybersecurity? And again, feel free, use your imagination. What do you think you would like to see as a real technological development that's really going to be useful in this space?
That's a very tricky question.
No right or wrong answers. This is
Yeah, look,
just for
I
fun.
think it's not new, but I think one of the things that may give us that step forward in next gen is SaaS, is cloud. How do we do more in the cloud for OT to give organizations more effective ways to manage their OT cybersecurity, I guess, concerns? We've got amazing technologies out there today that can go really deep. We can dissect protocols until there is no packets left on the wire. But at the end of the day, we're always finding new ways to gain visibility. We're always finding new ways to integrate to the existing tech stack that organizations already have, and that's key. And that's where we're investing a lot of time. But I think maybe SaaS there's something in the SaaS in the future that might be able to take us to that next level, maybe.
Interesting.
Agree. I think, and Michael and I are in the same boat. You can track innovations in IT, in OT, sort of as a laggard from some of the more innovations that you see in IT, software enterprise products, and the adoption of new technologies, whether it's blockchain or machine learning, AI. You're going to see a lot of those things mature in other areas and then make their way into OT. But I agree, that's cloud is probably far more of a bigger impact than all those together. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with the cloud answer. I mean, I think another aspect is, there's really not a concept of automated response to any great level in OT environments where, just everyone is rightfully so concerned about doing the wrong thing and knocking a process offline and not being able to recover. I think over the next several years, especially being able by cloud and AI, machine learning, whatever buzzword you want to use, I think you will get to the point where you are able to automate some responses. It may not be isolating a device from the network like you do in IT, but things around log collection, things around some sort of automated forensics. I think that I think that's kind of the next frontier in OT catching up with IT.
Oh, fantastic. Listening to your answers is giving me just, the hair on the back of my neck is just rising, going like, I really look forward to the future. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for the fantastic conversation. Thank you for your insights, your knowledge, your experience as well. I think everyone in this room and online has benefited from that. I really appreciate all of you making the trek down to Singapore as well to share your knowledge. I also want to, again, shout out to CSA. Tianqin did an amazing job putting this together. Raymond was also very, very relevant in terms of helping to arrange this and bring it all together. I'd like now to hand back to the lovely Charmaine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shourie, and our panelists. I'd like to invite you back to your seats at this point. Thank you very much. One more time for our entire panel, please, ladies and gentlemen. An amazing conversation, hearing everybody's thoughts on the OT environment. We hope to keep the conversation going, and everyone in the room is invited to the foyer for some light refreshments, mingle and network, of course. And on behalf of SICW 2022, thank you so much for choosing to spend the afternoon with us, and have a great rest of the day ahead. Thank you. See you soon.